The courtroom that changed everything. Cameron Langford was one of the wealthiest men in the world. A tech billionaire with a net worth north of $40 billion, he had made his fortune in artificial intelligence and robotics. He was brilliant, charming when he needed to be, but above all else, arrogant. He didn't just think he was better than most people, he believed it was a fact. The world was his playground, and the rules didn't apply to him. That's exactly why he found himself sitting in court that day, charged with securities fraud and insider trading. Cameron had always considered legal constraints more of a mild suggestion than actual boundaries, and for years, he had quietly manipulated the markets in his favor. But eventually, the law caught up with him. He walked into the courtroom dressed in a custom-tailored suit worth more than most people made in a year, wearing an air of disdain like a crown. His eyes scanned the room lazily until they fell on Judge Marcia Hayes, the presiding judge. She was a tall black woman with piercing eyes, a commanding presence, and a reputation for being fair but unflinching. Cameron smirked to himself. They really sent their best for me, he thought sarcastically. He hadn't even bothered to stand when she entered the courtroom, as was customary. The bailiff had called for everyone to rise, but Cameron remained seated, crossing his legs with casual indifference. The room grew tense. Judge Hayes paused at the bench, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took him in. She said nothing at first. Instead, she carefully adjusted her robes and looked directly at Cameron. "Mr. Langford," she said in a calm, measured tone. "Perhaps you didn't hear the bailiff's instruction to stand when the court is called to order." Cameron leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I heard," he replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "I just didn't think it was necessary." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The gallery was filled with journalists, legal observers, and curious onlookers who had come to witness the downfall of one of the tech world's most powerful figures. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. "I see. And what makes you think you're exempt from the rules that govern this court?" Cameron shrugged. "Respect is earned, Your Honor. Not demanded." The tension in the room thickened, but Judge Hayes remained unflappable. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the bench. "Respect is indeed earned, Mr. Langford," she said. "But so is justice. And I can assure you, you're about to get exactly what you've earned." The courtroom fell silent. Cameron expected her to launch into a long lecture or perhaps hold him in contempt of court. He was already preparing his next smarmy retort when she did something no one anticipated. Judge Hayes picked up her gavel and handed it to the bailiff. "This court is adjourned," she announced. "Mr. Langford, you're coming with me." The room erupted in confusion. Cameron frowned. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said. "We're taking a walk." Cameron was too stunned to resist as the bailiff escorted him from the courtroom and down a back hallway. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions, but Judge Hayes kept walking, leading him out a side door and into the bright sunlight outside the courthouse. She stopped on the courthouse steps, turned to him, and gestured at the bustling city before them. "Do you know what you've forgotten, Mr. Langford?" Cameron blinked. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "You've forgotten what it's like to be human," she said. "To see people, not as obstacles or tools, but as people. So, we're going to spend some time together. You're going to learn something today." For the next several hours, Judge Hayes took Cameron on an unorthodox journey through the city. They visited homeless shelters, legal aid clinics, and community centers. She introduced him to people who had been wronged by the system he had exploited for profit, families who had lost their homes, workers whose pensions had vanished, and small business owners crushed by corporate greed. At first, Cameron was dismissive, barely listening. But as the day wore on, something began to shift. He saw the pain in their eyes, the raw emotion in their voices. These were people who had fought every day to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush them, and he had been part of that machine. By the time they returned to the courthouse, Cameron was silent. His usual cockiness was gone, replaced by a contemplative expression. Judge Hayes stood at the entrance and looked him in the eye. "Mr. Langford, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability. Understanding the impact of your actions. If you can't see that, then you'll never change." Cameron nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he was at a loss for words. The next day in court, something unprecedented happened. Cameron stood before the judge, not with his high-powered legal team beside him, but alone. He didn't make excuses or attempt to negotiate a deal. Instead, he confessed to everything. He agreed to pay full restitution, fund programs for the communities he had harmed, and work with organizations dedicated to financial reform. He even gave up his role as CEO of his company, promising to dedicate himself to understanding the lives of ordinary people. The media called it a stunning fall from grace, but Judge Hayes saw it differently. As Cameron left the courtroom that day, she watched him with a thoughtful expression. Some lessons were hard-earned, but sometimes, just sometimes, people changed. And when they did, it left everyone stunned. Cameron's confession sent shockwaves through the media. For weeks, headlines couldn't get enough of the story: the arrogant billionaire who finally fell, Cameron Langford's public reckoning, and Judge Marcia Hayes, the woman who brought a giant to his knees. Pundits speculated about his motives. Some claimed it was a publicity stunt, a ploy to rebuild his reputation. Others believed Judge Hayes had orchestrated a psychological takedown too brilliant to ignore. But no one could deny the facts: Cameron was doing exactly what he had promised. He sold off luxury properties, liquidated millions in assets, and poured it into housing initiatives, education programs, and financial literacy campaigns for underprivileged communities. Still, the transformation wasn't without challenges. The next chapter, redemption, isn't easy. Cameron sat in a cramped office in the basement of a nonprofit center, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and buzzing fluorescent lights. His new job wasn't glamorous. It involved helping low-income families apply for financial aid and understanding the complexities of predatory lending practices. "Mr. Langford," an older woman said from across the desk, holding a stack of medical bills. "I don't understand how I owe this much. My husband passed away last year, and they just keep sending more." Her hands shook as she tried to explain. Cameron's instinct was to pass her off to someone else. "This isn't my problem," he thought at first. But then Judge Hayes's words echoed in his mind. "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability." He leaned forward, scanning her documents carefully. "These charges look illegal," he said softly. "We'll challenge them. You don't have to pay a dime until we get this sorted." For the first time in months, Cameron felt a strange warmth, something almost like purpose. The turning point. But not everyone welcomed his newfound altruism. At a gala fundraiser for one of the housing programs he'd funded, Cameron mingled among the city's wealthy elite. The old crowd, the same investors, tech moguls, and power brokers who once toasted his every success, now greeted him with cold stares. "Well, if it isn't St. Cameron," sneered Anthony Monroe, CEO of one of the rival tech companies. "How's life in the gutters of social reform?" Cameron chuckled, taking a sip of his champagne. "Better than life in the boardroom with snakes like you." Anthony's eyes darkened. "Careful, Cameron. You're not one of them. You never will be. No amount of charity will change what you are, or what you've done." Cameron felt the weight of those words. For the rest of the night, they haunted him. Could he ever really change? Or was this just a mask, a temporary act to ease his own guilt? An unexpected ally. It was late when Cameron returned to his modest apartment. He sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through the dozens of emails he received each day, some thanking him, others still accusing him of being a fraud. One email caught his eye. Subject: Remember me? Mr. Langford. You may not remember, but I was one of the workers at Atlantic Mills when you forced the company into bankruptcy and sold it for parts. I lost my job that day, and my family struggled for years. We never thought we'd recover. I hated you for a long time. But I saw what you did today at the community center. You helped my mother with her case. For the first time, I believe people can change. Thank you. Sincerely, Matthew Taylor. Cameron stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He typed back a quick reply. Thank you for your words. I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to make things right. If you ever want to talk, my door is open. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man walking towards something new, something unknown, but undeniably real. Judge Hayes's final words. Months later, Cameron found himself back in Judge Hayes's courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a guest speaker for a mentorship program for troubled youth. As he finished his talk, the students clapped politely. Judge Hayes approached him, her expression unreadable. Not bad, she said with a slight smile. You've come a long way. Cameron nodded. Thanks to you. No, she said, locking eyes with him. You did this yourself. I just gave you the push. Cameron smiled, feeling a rare sense of peace. As he walked out of the courtroom that day, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The shadows of his past would always linger. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of them. He welcomed the challenge. A new battle begins. Months passed. Cameron's journey of redemption was no longer front-page news, but it was far from over. His work with the nonprofit had grown into something larger, a movement. He started a foundation focused on exposing financial corruption and offering legal aid to victims of corporate greed. But Cameron quickly learned that the world he had once ruled wasn't willing to let him go quietly. Powerful enemies were watching. It started with harassment, anonymous threats sent to his office, investors quietly pulling funding, and old associates warning him to back off. He ignored them. I've faced worse, he thought. But then things escalated. One morning, as Cameron was leaving his apartment, he noticed something strange. His car, a sleek black Tesla, sat with its windows smashed. Slashed tires. The word traitor spray-painted across the hood. He stood there in silence, his breath steady but his mind racing. He knew exactly who was behind it, Anthony Monroe and the shadowy circle of tech elites who had once been his closest allies. He took out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. Judge Hayes? Her calm voice answered. Cameron. I wondered when you'd call. I think I need your help again. Uncovering the conspiracy. Within days, Cameron and Judge Hayes were deep in the heart of a new fight. This wasn't just about his redemption anymore, it was about exposing a network of corruption that stretched far beyond what Cameron had imagined. They discovered that Anthony Monroe and a group of powerful CEOs had been secretly funneling money into offshore accounts, manipulating markets, and crushing competitors through illegal tactics. They had framed small businesses, orchestrated bankruptcies, and even bribed politicians to cover their tracks. And now, they were coming for Cameron. One night, as Cameron worked late at the foundation, the lights flickered. He glanced at the security monitor. Two figures were approaching the front door, wearing dark clothing and ski masks. His pulse quickened. He locked the door and reached for his phone. This is real. An unexpected savior. Before Cameron could dial, the door burst open. He braced for the worst, but suddenly there was a loud bang, followed by a familiar voice. Freeze! Hands where I can see them. It was Judge Hayes. With a full security detail. The intruders dropped their tools and bolted, but the officers caught them before they could escape. Cameron leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Judge Hayes stepped forward, her sharp gaze taking in the scene. You really know how to make enemies, don't you? She said with a smirk. Cameron laughed breathlessly. Comes with the territory. The final blow. The arrests were just the beginning. The captured intruders turned out to be hired muscle with ties to Anthony Monroe's company. This gave Judge Hayes and Cameron exactly what they needed, a legal thread to pull. Within weeks, subpoenas were issued, documents seized, and secret recordings revealed. The house of cards collapsed. Anthony Monroe and several others were indicted on federal charges, securities fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The trial was a media circus, and this time, Cameron wasn't the defendant. He sat in the front row as Anthony took the stand, squirming under the weight of his own lies. Judge Hayes presided once again, her gaze unwavering. When the guilty verdict came down, Cameron felt a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. The future awaits. After the trial, Judge Hayes met Cameron on the courthouse steps. So, what's next? She asked. Cameron smiled thoughtfully. I don't know. But for once, I'm not afraid to find out. He extended his hand, and Judge Hayes shook it firmly. Whatever it is, she said, make it count. As Cameron walked away, the city skyline stretched before him. His old life was gone, but something better, something real, had taken its place. He wasn't just a man trying to redeem himself anymore. He was a man determined to change the system. And this time, nothing would stop him. The birth of a movement. The trial had made headlines worldwide. Cameron Langford, from billionaire villain to whistleblower hero. He could feel the public shifting their perception of him, not fully forgiving, but watching with cautious respect. His foundation had grown rapidly, becoming a hub for financial justice. He wasn't just offering legal aid anymore, he was organizing policy reform initiatives, lobbying Congress, and working with grassroots activists to dismantle predatory financial systems from the inside. But power, as Cameron knew too well, always fights back. A threat from the top. One evening, Cameron received a call from a private number. He answered cautiously. You're making a lot of noise, Langford, said a familiar voice. It was Senator William Rourke, an influential politician with deep ties to the financial sector. Some of us don't appreciate your little crusade. Cameron leaned back in his chair. Funny. I don't appreciate a system that ruins lives for profit. So I guess we're even. Rourke chuckled darkly. This isn't a game, son. Back off, or you'll regret it. The line went dead. Cameron sat in silence, the weight of the threat sinking in. He knew what Rourke was capable of. He had once donated millions to the senator's campaigns before his change of heart. But this time, I'm not walking away. The new plan. Cameron called an emergency meeting with Judge Hayes and his closest advisors. They're scared, Cameron said, pacing the room. That means we're close to something big. We need to hit harder. Judge Hayes tapped her chin thoughtfully. If Rourke is involved, we're not just dealing with business corruption anymore. This is political. We'll need evidence, real, undeniable proof. Cameron nodded. Then we'll get it. For weeks, they dug deeper, using every connection Cameron had left, reaching out to journalists, and filing dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests. Slowly, the picture became clear. A massive, coordinated effort to manipulate financial regulations, backed by corrupt politicians, lobbyists, and tech giants. Billions had been funneled into secret accounts while ordinary citizens were left to suffer. And at the center of it all, Senator Rourke. The reckoning. The evidence was overwhelming. Cameron's team prepared a comprehensive exposé, partnering with one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. The report detailed the entire conspiracy, from the rigged markets to the offshore accounts and political bribes. When the story broke, it was like a bomb going off. Shadow government, the billion-dollar conspiracy exposed. Senator William Rourke accused of corruption and fraud. Public outrage was immediate. Protests erupted across the country, demanding justice and sweeping reform. But Rourke wasn't going down without a fight. He launched a vicious counterattack, accusing Cameron of fabricating the entire story to save his own reputation. He called for federal investigations into Cameron's foundation, suggesting that Cameron was still a conman, just playing a different game. The media split into factions. Some praised Cameron as a hero, others painted him as a manipulative opportunist. The final showdown. The tension came to a head during a Senate hearing, where Cameron was called to testify. The room was packed, cameras rolling, reporters scribbling furiously. Rourke sat at the head of the committee, glaring down at Cameron with thinly veiled hatred. "Mr. Langford," Rourke said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You seem to have a talent for reinventing yourself. First as a billionaire tech mogul, now as a self-styled crusader for justice. Tell me, why should we trust you now?" Cameron leaned forward, calm and unshaken. "Because I've already lost everything once. I have nothing left to hide, Senator. Can you say the same?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Rourke's face hardened, but Cameron pressed on. "This isn't about me. It's about the millions of people who've been crushed by the system you helped build. The single mothers who lost their homes. The retirees whose pensions were stolen. The small business owners who never stood a chance. You've profited off their pain for decades. That ends now." The gallery burst into applause. Rourke tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Within days, Rourke was formally charged. His political career was over. The aftermath. Cameron's victory was bittersweet. The battle had taken a toll on his reputation, his friendships, even his health. But as he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the crowd of supporters cheer, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Judge Hayes joined him, her usual stern expression softened by a rare smile. "Well, Mr. Langford. Looks like you've done it again." "Not alone," Cameron said, glancing at her. "Never alone." She nodded. "So what's next?" Cameron gazed out at the sea of people holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "Reform the System." He knew the fight wasn't over. Not even close. "Now," he said, "we build something better." And with that, he walked down the steps, ready to face whatever came next. A new chapter, into the political arena. The fallout from Senator Rourke's trial was massive. Corrupt politicians resigned in disgrace, corporate heads were arrested, and sweeping reforms were finally on the table. But the system was still fragile, and Cameron knew it wouldn't hold unless someone took charge and fought to make real, lasting change. That's when the calls began. Activists, community leaders, and even former rivals reached out with a surprising proposition. Cameron, you should run for office. At first, Cameron laughed it off. Him? A politician? It felt ridiculous. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He had the resources, the connections, and most importantly, the trust of the people. He'd been on both sides of the system. Who better to reform it? Judge Hayes was skeptical at first. Politics is a different battlefield, she warned him over coffee one evening. They'll dig up everything. Every mistake, every lie you've ever told. I know, Cameron said, staring into his cup. But I've already faced the worst of it. If I don't do this, who will? Hayes smiled faintly. You've changed, Cameron. I never thought I'd say this, but maybe you're ready. The campaign begins. Cameron launched his campaign for Senate, running on a bold platform of transparency, corporate accountability, and financial justice. His slogan, "Power Back to the People," quickly caught fire. Supporters flooded the streets. His speeches went viral, striking a chord with ordinary citizens who had felt ignored for too long. But not everyone was thrilled about Cameron's rise. His enemies regrouped, forming a powerful alliance of old money elites, corporate lobbyists, and political insiders determined to destroy him. Their goal was simple: discredit him at all costs. The betrayal. The attacks started subtly, anonymous leaks to the press, rumors about his past, whispers that his transformation was just an elaborate con. Cameron brushed it off at first. But then came the real blow. A trusted member of his inner circle, Jason Holt, his closest advisor and longtime friend, turned on him. Jason leaked a series of confidential documents to the press, twisting facts to make it look like Cameron had hidden funds in offshore accounts. The media pounced. Langford caught in new scandal. Is he still the same man? Cameron's poll numbers plummeted overnight. Allies distanced themselves. His campaign was on the verge of collapse. Judge Hayes to the rescue. Judge Hayes stormed into Cameron's campaign office late one night, her eyes blazing. What the hell is going on? Jason sold me out, Cameron said, his voice hollow. He spun everything to make it look like I'm guilty. The press believes him. Then we fight back, Hayes said firmly. We've come too far to let this stop us. You've got the truth on your side, now use it. Cameron nodded slowly. The old version of him would have folded. But not this time. He held a press conference the next morning, addressing the scandal head-on. Yes, I made mistakes in my past, he told the crowd. But this campaign has never been about perfection, it's about redemption and change. The people behind this attack want to distract us from what really matters, fixing a broken system. But I won't back down. Not now. Not ever. His honesty struck a nerve. The public, weary of fake apologies and polished politicians, began to rally around him once more. The comeback. With Hayes' help, Cameron's team uncovered proof that Jason had been paid off by a corporate PAC linked to one of Cameron's biggest opponents. The truth came out, clearing Cameron's name. Jason fled the country in disgrace, but Cameron's message was stronger than ever. The old system will do anything to protect itself. But together, we can tear it down and build something better. His numbers soared. Volunteers flooded his campaign offices. Donations poured in from ordinary citizens, not corporate interests. Cameron's movement had taken on a life of its own. Election night. The night of the election was electric. The results came in slowly at first, but as each district reported, it became clear, Cameron Langford had won. His victory speech was broadcast nationwide. Standing on a makeshift stage in front of thousands of cheering supporters, Cameron took a deep breath. "This isn't just a victory for me," he said, his voice steady. "It's a victory for every person who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside by a system that was supposed to protect them. Today, we take the first step towards something new, together." The crowd roared. Judge Hayes stood in the front row, clapping slowly, her eyes filled with pride. The first challenge. But Cameron's victory was only the beginning. As the newly elected senator, he immediately set to work, pushing for sweeping financial reforms and transparency laws. But Washington was a maze of backroom deals and hidden agendas, far more complicated than he expected. His enemies regrouped once again, determined to block his every move. Some even plotted his political downfall, while others whispered about more permanent solutions. One night, Cameron received an anonymous message on his phone. "Watch your back. Not everyone in D.C. plays fair." He stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. He knew the fight was far from over. If anything, it was just getting started. A dangerous game. Cameron knew the warning text wasn't just paranoia. His fight had threatened powerful players in Washington, and they weren't about to sit back quietly. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening: surveillance vans parked outside his apartment, bank accounts mysteriously frozen, and political allies suddenly backing away from his proposed reforms. Judge Hayes was worried. "Cameron, you've made enemies before, but this is different. These people don't just ruin reputations, they destroy lives." "I know," Cameron said, pacing his office. "But if we back down now, everything we've worked for will be lost." He leaned on his network of supporters, activists, lawyers, and whistleblowers to expose the hidden forces working against him. It was a dangerous game, but Cameron was determined to bring everything into the light. The final showdown. The turning point came during a Senate session where Cameron introduced the Corporate Accountability and Financial Transparency Act, a sweeping bill aimed at dismantling the corrupt networks that had controlled Washington for decades. His opponents fought back viciously. Lobbyists poured millions into smear campaigns, accusing Cameron of being a fraud. Anonymous sources fed the media stories claiming he was still hiding his past crimes. The bill's passage seemed impossible. Then, at the 11th hour, Judge Hayes stepped forward once again. This time, not as a quiet ally behind the scenes, but as a witness before the Senate Judiciary Committee. "I've known Cameron Langford since the worst moment of his life," Hayes testified. "I watched him face his past and work tirelessly to make amends, not just with words, but with action. What you're seeing here is not a con man. It's a man determined to do what's right, no matter the cost." Her words changed everything. Suddenly, public opinion shifted. Senators who had been on the fence began to reconsider. And then, the unthinkable happened: the bill passed. Victory and sacrifice. The victory was monumental. For the first time in decades, new laws brought real accountability to Wall Street and transparency to political funding. Corrupt executives were forced to resign. Corporate giants were broken apart, and powerful lobbyists lost their grip on the government. But victory came at a price. In the weeks that followed, Cameron found himself ostracized by the political elite. Though beloved by the people, he became a pariah in Washington, a constant target for those still loyal to the old system. Death threats became routine, and some of his closest allies quietly distanced themselves for their own safety. One evening, Judge Hayes joined Cameron for a quiet dinner. They sat in his modest townhouse, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. "You did it," Hayes said softly. "You really did it." Cameron smiled, but it was tired and bittersweet. We did it. But I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Hayes nodded, understanding. Maybe it's time to step back. You've laid the foundation. Let others carry the torch. Cameron stared out the window, thinking of all the battles still ahead. But for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The last move. A week later, Cameron called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, waiting for yet another announcement. But this time, it wasn't about a new bill or investigation. I've spent the last few years fighting for change, Cameron began. It's been the hardest and most rewarding work of my life. But change doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to all of us. Today, I'm stepping away from public office. The crowd gasped. Cameron's raised a hand to silence them. This isn't the end. It's a new beginning, for me and for the movement we've built together. I trust that what we started will continue to grow, stronger than ever. As he stepped away from the podium, there was a standing ovation. A new life. In the months that followed, Cameron disappeared from the spotlight. He moved to a quiet town on the coast, where he started teaching financial literacy to underprivileged students. Occasionally, he'd receive letters from former colleagues or citizens whose lives had been changed by his work. One day, Judge Hayes visited him unannounced. "Still causing trouble?" she asked, standing on his porch with a mischievous smile. "Not as much as I used to," Cameron replied. "But there's always time." They shared a laugh, the sun setting behind them. Cameron had finally found what he'd been searching for all along: not power, not redemption, but purpose and peace. And for the first time in his life, it was enough.